Hello again. Today we will be continuing our music theory journey for NCEA Level 1. Let's get into it. Firstly, let's have a look at note values. Now, a bar consists of 4 beats. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, a note that lasts 1 beat is called a crotchet. This can also be called a quarter note because it is worth 1/4 of a bar. But for these videos, we will refer to them as their European names, i.e. our crotchet. So, we also have the crotchet rest, which is also worth 1 beat in the bar. This means that in one whole bar we can have 4 crotchet values. Now, let's have a look at something that is faster than a crotchet. This would be the quaver. The quaver is only worth half of a beat. That means we need 2 quavers to equal 1 beat. If we have 2 beside each other, then we use this beam to beam them together. In this case, we have 2, which will equal 1 whole beat. This means that everything will be pushed back. This is 1 beat, then we'll start beat 2 on here. We also have the quaver rest, which is only worth half a beat, same as the quaver. And if we go even faster than that, then we get the semi-quaver, which has 2 tails, and that is worth 1/4 of a beat. This means 4 semi-quavers equals 1 crotchet, or 1 beat. Similar to the quaver, when we have 2 or more of them, up to 4, because that equals a beat, then what we do is we beam them, but instead we have 2 beams. And that's how we identify them as semi-quavers. Now let's look at some note values that last longer than a crotchet. If I draw up our beats again, and I'm going to place a minim. A minim is worth 2 beats. And the same, we have the minim rest, which is also worth 2 beats. Now just remember that the minim rest looks like a top hat, and we can remember that the top hat value is worth 2, because this brings me to our next note value, which is a semi-breve. A semi-breve is worth 4 beats and takes up the whole bar. And And we also have the semi-breve rest, which points downwards. Now these can be very easy to mix up between the up and the down, because they look very similar but have a huge difference. This is worth all of the beats within the bar, whereas this one only takes up 2. So just remember that the top hat means that there are 2 beats being taken up. Now let's look at dotted values. Here, if we have a minim, which we know as having 2 beats in the bar, if we add a dot next to it, we extend its value by half. So here we have our minim being worth 2, and the dot extends half of that value, and half of that is 1. So in total we will have 3 beats being taken up, as we have 2 from the minim and 1 from the dot. Therefore we have 3 in total. And if we have the crotchet and we add a dot beside it, we have 1.5 beats. This is because the crotchet by itself is worth 1, and the dot adds half of that value, which is 1/2. So adding those 2 together, we have 1.5. So if we want to finish the 4 beats in this bar, then we're going to have to complete this 1.5. Now something that's worth half a beat is a quaver. So if we have 1.5 plus half, it will equal 2. So I'm going to add a quaver here just before the 2 beat, because we're going to have 1.5 and then our half, and that will get us to our second beat. Now our second beat could have a crotchet, which equals 1 beat. So now we're going to 3. So our third beat could have a minim, which means it takes up the remainder of the beats within this bar. So this is an example of what a 4-beat bar can look like. Now something important to remember is imagining a dotted line in the middle of the bar. We can have a beat here and a beat there, and that's fine because this crotchet takes up that beat and this crotchet takes up this beat. But if we want to change this note to a minim, then that might not be a good idea. Now, this might look correct. It has the correct amount of beats within this bar. It has 1, 2, 3, 4 beats in total. But we cross this imaginary line. It may not look wrong, but when we read it, it might be confusing. Therefore, whenever crossing that we just add a tie to tie both of them together. So now let's have a little quiz to help you test your knowledge. I'm going to write down some note values and you're going to help me identify what they are. So why don't you pause the video and determine what these note values are. I would like their European name and how many beats they are worth. Alright, so this first note is a crotchet and it is worth 1 beat. Next, we have a quaver rest, and it is worth half a beat. Next, we have the semi-breve rest, and it is worth 4 beats in total. And lastly, we have the dotted minim, and that is worth 3 beats. Now let's look at time signatures. So a time signature can be found at the start of the bar. Now the time signature determines how many beats are in the bar and what type of note values we will be using. So, the top number determines how many beats are in the bar. In this case, for a typical 4/4 time signature, we have 4 beats in the bar. Now, this bottom number determines what type of note values we will be using. So this means that we might have some semi-breves, we might have some minims, we might have some crotchets and quavers. If this bottom note is something different, such as an 8, then instead we might be using something like crotchets and quavers, as well as some semi-quavers. This doesn't mean that you can't use semi-quavers when the bottom number is 4. It just means that they're going to be less common. But whereas in a 4/8, we're going to have them being more common as semi-quavers, quavers, and crotchets. Now, if our bottom number is a 2, then we're probably going to be using larger values like quite a few minims and quite a few crotchets and possibly the occasional quaver. Now, let's talk about compound and simple time signatures. Now, if the top number is a 2, 3, or a 4, then we're going to call this a simple time signature. And this is because we only have a few beats in the bar. Now, if those numbers are 6, 9, or 12, then we're going to call this compound. And this is because we have a large amount of beats in the bar. Next, we're going to talk about duple, triple, and quadruple. If our top value is a 2 or a 6, then we will call this duple. For example, if we have 2, 4, then we have a simple duple. This is because from before, a 2 on the top means that it is a simple time signature. And then now, if it's a 2 or a 6, it is a duple signature. So this is considered a simple duple time signature. Similar, if we have the 6 there instead, then it's still going to be duple, but the simple will change to compound. Now let's look at the triple values. This is 3 and 9 for our triple values. Now, if we have a 3 as before, we have a simple time signature. Therefore, 3, 4 is a simple triple time signature. And if we change this 3 to a 9, so it's a 9/4 signature, instead of a simple time signature, we have a compound. So this means that 9/4 is a compound triple time signature. And lastly, let's look at the quadruple time signature. This is if the top number is a 4 or a 12. In this case, for our 4/4 time signature, a 4 on the top is simple, and then a 4 on the top means that we have quadruple. Therefore, 4/4 is a simple quadruple time signature. Similar, we have the 12 on top, then the simple is now going to be compound since it's the larger numbers. And we're going to have compound quadruple. This means that 12/4 time signature is a compound quadruple time signature. Now I'm going to write down some time signatures, and I'd like you to pause the video and try and work them out. Perfect. So our first time signature is 9/4. The top value determines whether it's compound or simple, and in this case it's compound. The top number also determines if it is duple, triple or quadruple. In this case we have a triple. Next we have a 12-2 time signature. The top value determines if we have a compound or a simple time signature. In this case, we have a compound time signature. The 12 also determines that we have a quadruple time signature. Therefore, 12-2 is a compound quadruple time signature. Next, we have a 4-2 time signature. The 4 at the top means that we have a simple time signature. The 4 at the top also means that we have a quadruple time signature. Therefore, 4-2 is a simple quadruple time signature. Next, we have a 3-4 time signature. The 3 at the top determines that this is a simple time signature. The 3 at the top also determines that this is a triple time signature. Therefore, a 3-4 time signature is a simple triple time signature. Lastly, we have a 6-8. The 6 determines that this is a compound time signature. The 6 also determines that this is a triple time signature. So this is a compound triple time signature. And that's everything you need to know about time signatures. For tempo and dynamics, I have a resource down below to help you work through memorizing these two concepts. Because they're quite large and quite broad, you can easily flashcard and memorize them to help you in the exam. Now we're going to look at articulation. Articulation is further things that we can do to manipulate the dynamic or the sound of our notes. So here we have a tie. I've described a tie before, but effectively it adds the two values together. This only occurs if the notes are the same note. So here we have two crotchets, and without the tie they're worth 1 beat each. And when we tie them together, they'll now be worth 2 beats. Now, if this next note is a different note, in this example we have a D and an E, and if we decide to put a tie, it's no longer called a tie, and now it's called a slur. Now, a slur effectively means to play them smoothly. So next we're going to look at staccato. So a staccato dot is found just below or just above, depending on which way our stem is going. A staccato dot effectively means to shorten the note. So if we have our normal 1 beat, we're going to play it faster, so it's going to be stronger. Alright, so now we're going to look at accents. Now, accents might be mistaken with a crescendo, as it is the same exact shape, except it's slightly smaller. Now, the accent is found below the note in which it's going to affect. So an accent means to play it louder, which is effectively what a crescendo does. But in this case, it only affects the note that it is under. Lastly, we have the fermata. So the fermata effectively means to play the note for however you feel it needs to be. Usually these are found at the end of a section or at the end of a piece, and are usually minims, and usually you hold it slightly longer than 2 beats, but it really depends on however you or your conductor wants it to go on for. And that concludes articulation. Now we're going to look at texture. Texture is the analysis of the shape of the music we are provided with. So texture looks at how many instruments are playing, whether we have a lot of instruments or a small amount of instruments, and we also look at the relationships between all of the instruments, whether we're all playing in unison, so the same note, or whether we are harmonizing, or whether we're doing something completely chaotic and different. So here we have monophonic. Monophonic effectively means a melody that is in unison. So that might mean one instrument playing a melody by itself, or that might mean 2 or more instruments are playing the same melody in static unison. Next we have homophonic. Now this means that there are 2 or more melodies in static harmony. So as you can see, these 2 instruments here are creating intervals that aren't in unison and therefore are creating harmony. And next we have polyphonic. Now this means that we have 2 or more melodies that are playing completely different things. So in this case we have a canon, which is effectively 2 instruments mimicking each other. So our top instrument is playing melody and the second instrument is playing it as well, but starting from our second beat. So in this case it's polyphonic because they're playing, when they're played together, it sounds different and not together, since they are effectively 2 separate things. So next we have our thick and thin texture. So here we have a 4-part piece. In our first bar, it starts off with 1 instrument. This means that it's quite thin because we only have 1 instrument playing, and therefore it is also monophonic. But then in our third beat, in our first bar, it becomes slightly thicker since we're introducing a new instrument. It also is homophonic because they are playing in static harmony. But then when we come into our second bar, our texture is quite thick as we have all of our pieces playing. So in our third bar, we start off having it monophonic and quite thin because there's only one instrument playing. And then in our third beat, or second half of our third bar, we then branch out into our thick texture due to the fact that all or more than a few are being played at once. That's everything you need to know about texture.